Welcome, everybody. Good afternoon. We're here live on the Healthy Indoors Live Show. I'm your host, Bob Krell. I'm your moderator for the show and the founder and publisher of Healthy Indoors Magazine. Today, we have with us both Jeff and Connie May, who are the co-authors of the latest edition of the book, My House is Killing Me, which you saw a graphic for momentarily. Let's see, this is the second edition from Johns Hopkins publications. They published their first one many years ago. This is a revised version with a lot more content. We're really excited to talk about that. They're co-authors of numerous other books in the IAQ space. Jeff has been a long-term veteran of the industry since the early 90s. He's been out there as a consultant in the field, widely published, widely presenting at industry events. He's been around, he's actually been around a long time and done a lot of very impressive work. He's also one of our contributors to Healthy Indoors Magazine. He writes the column May's Ways every month. So we're really excited to have you guys here. Welcome.
Thank you for having
Jeff
me.
and Connie, how are you?
Good. Thank you for having us.
Great.
And in the co-host seat, as always, as most always, the ever-present healthy building scientist, Mr. Joe Medosh. Welcome, Joe.
Great to be here. I'm really honored to have you here, Jeff. You are somebody I always have looked up to and admire, and have your book. In fact, your new book is an audio book. For those of you that don't know that and want to struggle to find time to read it, just listen to it in your car. That's a phenomenal upgrade, Jay. Way to go. Jeffrey, sorry.
So, with that, we've got some set questions that we'd like to get into with Jeff and Connie, and then we'll, the second half of the show, for those of you here that are in our live virtual studio audience, we'll let you guys hop in, fire your cameras up, and pose some questions to all of us here, and we'll entertain that from about 1:30 on. So I guess I wanted to start out, Jeff and Connie. So what prompted the second edition of the book?
Well, we were approached by the publisher, and Joe Rusco at Johns Hopkins University Press contacted us and said that they were interested in doing a second edition. And My House is Killing Me was the first book on air quality, indoor air quality, that Jeff and I wrote together. We were published authors before. We'd written textbooks as educators, but My House is Killing Me was the first one. And Jeff had learned an awful lot of information since we wrote it in 2001. And we had many more case studies, and we'd worked with many more clients. So we were interested in doing the second edition. We didn't realize how much work it would be until we got our teeth into it. But in the end, it has a lot more information than the first edition. But
well, it clearly has a lot more weight. I mean, this book, and you mentioned that in the pre-show that it was heavier paper, but no, it's also a heavier content. There's a lot more stuff in this book. This is a very thorough compendium of information on indoor air quality.
I mean, we wouldn't have thought of it if they hadn't contacted us. We'd sort of put the writing part of our lives on hold, to be truthful, because it's so much work. But once we got started, we were pretty excited about it.
It's you've been known for this for a while, right? The original My House is Killing Me was your first book in the IAQ space, right? And that was originally published in what year?
2001. Yeah.
And,
I thought your new title should be My Home is Still Killing Me, because people read your book. They didn't.
It's actually true.
Yeah, because they didn't. People aren't really. They're reading this information. They're gathering, they're like, oh, that was a great read, but I didn't do anything in my home. So it's really shocking that people find all this stuff out, and yet they still are reluctant to take action. So I still think it's eventually the final book will be like My Home Killed Me.
Oh, I don't like that.
One of the things that I took notice of right in the beginning of the book, you made a reference that I thought was just super interesting to cilantro. Early in the first chapter, people that some people are predisposed to actually find cilantro to be a really great seasoning, great herbal seasoning, and some people think it tastes like soap, and there's a predisposition there of people that of the latter group that think it tastes like soap chemically, that there's some issues they're predisposed to and indoor environmental issues, which is
Absolutely, sure. Yeah, that's a really good comparison, actually. Yeah,
Well, we live it because for me, it's soap. For you, you love it.
yeah, I eat cilantro. I love it. So there's a specific gene that codes for a specific chemical sensor, and the chemical sensor is for the fragrant part of the cilantro. And for people who don't have that sensor, they only taste the soap part.
Well, now people are getting all of these genetic, profiles, and I think that then they come back and ask you more questions and continue to do that. I think that we're headed towards this path of learning maybe a little bit more about predispositions of people that actually are sensitive to other things in the homes that we still think of only as an immune response. Maybe there's other things that are genetic that we still have no clue about. So I think that the next 10, 15 years could actually open up a lot of opportunities to learn more about what are you predisposed to, and hopefully homes are also going to be disclosing what's in your home, so you can try to find a home that fits me. So when you go to the grocery store, whether cilantro tastes like soap, but I move into a house, I don't know that there's something in that house that could actually cause me to have reactions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And we see that a lot in families. It typically, it's the women that are affected more so by men, almost, I'd say probably 2 to 1, where they become sensitized either to allergens or odors or something like that. And often, the husbands don't actually believe them. They're not very supportive. I mean, many are, but some are not. And we've actually had a few divorces where, the woman gets the report and, it's like, you SOB, you never believed me.
As a consultant too, I've run into that so many times over the years. How often have you found yourself almost in the role of marriage counselor? They say that IAQ consultants, we shouldn't be, giving medical opinions, but sometimes we're giving life counseling opinions. It's crazy.
It happens a lot.
People who call us are often under a great deal of stress, and
I'll get it.
So let's stay on that path briefly for just a second, Jeff. So you go to a home and you have somebody who says that I have all these conditions in my home, and it may only be one of the people in the house, right? Which it does make a lot of more stress. Okay. Why don't you talk us through that? We also understand some of the tools, but why don't you talk about how you work with that client as a tool, or as to get them to understand more about their home or their conditions, or let's be hyper aware of the time of day or where. Can you talk through and give some advice to those listening? Because most people don't understand how to use the occupant in the same way we use our other tools.
Right. Well, we always sit down and do an interview first, or at least, or on the phone anyway, beforehand, to get any kind of information. And then I have all these sensitivities myself. I mean, I'm allergic to all kinds of things, chemical sensitivity. So it's actually, it's pretty easy for me as I go through the environment to actually decide, where there are problems and where I want to take samples. So it's actually happened to me a couple of times where, I'd be walking down to a space and I'll start to cough, and then the husband turns to me and says, "Gee, my wife coughs at that spot all the time too." And in one case, it turned out there was some loose floorboards. It was oak floor and then subfloor, and there'd been some kind of water problem there. And when you step on the oak, it would compress the air, and then the mold spores would come out through the crack. And I actually took an air sample at the crack and walked around a little bit, and could actually show that there were, a lot of either Aspergillus or Penicillium spores coming between the two floors.
Wow.
So, we like to find out what the problem areas are. And then a lot of the things that I do that I guess is very different. I take a lot of samples. We sample rugs, couches, pillows, dogs. I've taken, a sample from a bird, actually. A bird flapped his wings, and I took But, that's how I learn about what's actually, what the sources are. And that's really, in my opinion, that's the most important thing that any air quality person has to do is they, if you take an air sample, it doesn't tell you anything really. I mean, it can tell you if there's a problem, but it doesn't tell you, what the source is. And so by source sampling, you can actually figure out where the allergens or irritants are coming from.
So I just want to elaborate. I just want to elaborate.
Yeah, you had
briefly.
mentioned on that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So on what you may sampling, everybody here has got their own method of sampling. So you said you sample dog and bird and a variety of stuff. Why don't you just talk briefly about what type of sampling you're doing or how you're doing it? How do you get the bird to sit still to sample it? That kind of stuff. Right?
I have the homeowner hold the bird. No, I use a Burkhardt air sampler to do all my samples, but it's just a spore trap, and I take a spatula and I'll hit the surface and then just collect the aerosol that comes up. And the reason I like the Burkhardt is it's a glass slide with grease on it. You take the slide out, you look at the sample, and if there's too little, you have to do it again. If there's too much, you may want to do it again and with less of a bang. But you can sample carpets, clothing. I mean, I this was a crazy thing. I was looking at a radio station one time, and the woman who was running the radio station was having all these allergy problems. And I went into one of the rooms in the radio station. I didn't have any problem breathing. And then I was talking to her in the same room, and I was having a lot of trouble breathing. So I went back to test again, and there was no problem. So I realized that she was the problem. So I took a pat sample. I tapped her shoulder, and I put the Burkhardt spore trap sampler there. I took a sample of the dust, and there was an entire dust mite in the sample, and I'm very allergic to dust mites. And when I called her up and told her about the results, she said she was on her way to the beauty parlor to get her hair dyed, and she was wearing an old sweater that she never washed, and that was the mites.
I'm assuming you didn't use the spatula on the bird, though.
Oh no, the bird actually was flapping his wings. And
you said there's three common, three most common sources of indoor air quality problems in homes.
Yeah, well, the
300, 600.
yeah, right. We did a study of all the reports that I had done. So we compared the results of 600 sick houses to 300 control houses. So the control houses were homes that I had looked at strictly for real estate purposes. And we just looked at certain characteristics of the home. So if they had air conditioning, if they had, hot water heat or finished basements or carpets and so forth. So then in the Boston area at the time, only 19% of homes had central air conditioning. And that basically was what the Census Bureau data agreed. It was perfect. It was 19%. But of the homes that people were sick in, the 600 homes, 37% had central air conditioning. And so the likelihood of having, asthma, respiratory problems are almost double in a home with central air. And that kind of leads to the second thing. Maybe you could put that picture up of the air conditioning, the pan. Oh, perfect. Okay. So, I'm sure there you go. Most of you have seen, condensate or pans and air conditioning systems like that. And this is a picture of the pan when it's all dried out in the heating season. But in the summer, when the air conditioning is operating, the pan is full of water. And it's also full of all microorganisms. It's full of bacteria. It's full of maybe full of yeast. There may be mold growing on the surface. So it's a very, very potentially allergenic soup. And all of the microorganisms secrete allergens into the water to digest things, and they produce byproducts that are allergenic. So
I just want to make sure people know what that picture is. I know some people are savvy and some are less. So that is above your air handler. There is a box or a plenum, and inside that is usually a coil for cooling, and that's where all the water actually drips down and drains out of the PVC pipe on the side of your unit. So that it's inside you. Some people think of the drain as maybe what's below the unit, but that's actually inside, and that white area is the coil that exchanges the heating and cooling inside. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. So the one of the chapters, the new chapters in the book is entitled Trojan horse allergens, and I think, you know, for people who are listening who do air quality, often, you know, you can't find an exact source of a problem, and you know, I believe that in many cases the reason is that there are surrogate allergens. There are non-discrete particles that have allergens on them, and they can originate in that pan or just about any other place where there's been microbial growth. So I think if you could, Bob, could you show the slide of that pollen grain?
I sure can.
Yeah, okay. So this is a greatly magnified pollen grain, and it's leaking. Now I use acid fuchsin stain to stain things, and so it stains proteins and allergens pink, and sometimes the water, the medium, makes the pollen grain burst, and you can see the pollen grains are full of starch granules, and the pollen grain is many times, it's 50 times bigger than the actual starch granules. And what they found in some countries is after rain, that the asthma admissions in hospitals goes up dramatically. And the theory is that the allergens are on these much smaller particles rather than the larger pollen grains. So what happens is those starch granules have the allergen from the pollen grain on them, and then they can be inhaled deeper to the lung. And so it's very similar to the cornstarch. People have latex allergy. They breathe in protein allergens on the starch granules. So if you have drywall dust in an air conditioning pan or cellulose or anything, once it's sitting in that allergenic liquid, when it dries, it can be aerosolized. And so you can take an air sample in a space and you'll see no mold spores, no pollen. You may see some inorganic particles or small bits of sort of uncharacterizable dust, but people can be having allergy symptoms from that. So those are surrogate allergens.
No, that's new to the book. That wasn't
Yeah.
in the first edition.
So, you know, one of the questions that people have asked, how does a consumer become an educated consumer and be a smart shopper of indoor air quality services, whether it be consulting or, you know, people are contracting for various things in the sector? What does a general consumer need to know? How can they make smart choices?
We have that in the book too.
Yeah, that we have that in the book. You want to answer that one?
No,
Okay.
we have a chapter in the book called Testing and Remediation, and we talk about just those issues, and we have lists of questions that consumers can ask professionals when they, you know, call to find out about their services. You have to do your research, and you know, we added that because people have often asked us that question over the years.
Well, and we all know that that's one of the most challenging conditions. That even if somebody says they're certified, they can show you some credentials, and credentials does not mean qualified. That's a real challenge in our industry. That, you know, I've got some credential that I got on a weekend, webinar, and now they think they actually can go, you know, do sampling and do diagnostics. It's one thing to sample; it's another to understand what's happening in the home. That's a world of difference, and people just think that sample tells them everything. When you know, as well as I do, it's about what you're experiencing, what you're visually, and what your occupant's telling you. Then your supporting sample confirms your evidence. But to think that your sample tells you everything is what people really kind of go down the wrong path on.
It's also an interdisciplinary profession. You know, you have to know something about building science. You should know something about practical science. You should be a good listener. I mean, it really pulls on a lot of skills. And I think the best, you know, the most effective indoor air quality professional is someone who has those skills and training and practical experience.
Well, I mean, Joe cited, all the certifications that fly around the industry, and all of us here on this call have some of those voluntary acronyms. But that's not just limited to those. I mean, there's licensures out there. Like for example, I won't name the state that I live in, but like the mold license. You take a 4-day class, pass a 50-question multiple choice test, and now you're an assessor, and you're qualified to go out and actually consult and write specs for mold remediation jobs.
I actually ran into a consultant who claims that he's a certified mycotoxin investigator. And I kind of researched that, and I found that he took a 1-hour, online video about mycotoxin testing.
That would be a great show for Netflix or something, the mycotoxin hunter, that's the kind of stuff that kind of leads to. Yeah.
Oh God. Yeah, but that you definitely led to a point there, right? Because that's what from a consumer perspective, right? What do they have to judge by? They have the credentials that the various professionals hand to them, and and it's even more complicated, I think, when it's a state issued licensure, because it seems to have value, right? I mean, you got this card from the state. Doesn't that mean that they're qualified? And it's like,
yeah, I think there are some places that have evaluations of people. Maybe that's that's kind of helpful. I don't know if have you run into problems where people get into trouble where they've used someone that had really good recommendations?
Sure.
Well, yeah, that's not uncommon because people are like, hey, get your brother and your family to all chime in or something. So yeah.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I went to we were in some town we were traveling through, and I looked online for the best restaurant or something like that, and it took us to a Home Depot parking lot, and there was a hot dog stand there, and that was the place that it directed me to, and I was the lousiest hot dog I ever ate.
I was gonna say, I mean, was it at least a good hot dog?
No, it wasn't any good. It was terrible, and he had all of his friends saying what a great place it was.
But again, that leads to that same point, and I'd even raise the argument. Let's stir it up here for the Q&A later. Does the fact that a lot of or many sectors in IAQ require or are driven toward third-party consultants, not having contractors also do testing or not doing design builds, and I know that's been the model for the asbestos industry, ever since that industry kind of shook out, and it's been the model in 7 states now, 8 states in the United States that require separate third party. But does that third party mean anything? Like you just illustrated, Joe. How do you know it's not the brother-in-law's company that's the consultant? I don't. People cheat.
Well, the ACAC is pretty good. I mean, I took that test, and that was a pretty thorough, difficult test. So I think people who've done ACAC know their stuff.
No, I wouldn't question that, Jeff. I think there's some really good voluntary programs out there. My question is when you try to regulate competency, and integrity and common sense, and honesty, you can't really regulate that very well,
Yeah, well, I think the one thing that is missing, what the ACAC does do, is they want to know what's your experience, how long you've been in the industry. You need to actually, submit something that says I've been working with so and so for so long, and that amount of time determines what level you actually get when you pass your test. So there are some checks and balances with some. Others, you just go take a class, and you were a banker a month ago, and now you are an expert in assessing homes and testing for mold. So that's really the difference between some of these is I don't need any kind of a justification as I actually have experience. So
is ACAC really a common term for that acronym? I always say ACAC. I'm just ACAC sounds to me like it's something that's happened in World War II with anti-aircraft.
It should be educational programs, really.
Yeah. Well, I want to Joe wanted to know, I think, about something about dust mites. I think I'd like to get back to dust mites.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite topics.
So I'll prompt the question. So according to some, so you can verify or not, that dust mites were actually not here in America prior to, we'll just say 1970. So can you, deny, clarify, or tell us more about the history of dust mites as best you can, without giving away your book?
I should say in general, like allergists were considered, voodoo workers for a long time. It was not a sort of very respectable discipline, for doctors. And so it didn't really become much of a profession until relatively late compared to, let's say heart doctors and surgery and all these other sort of subspecialties. So they didn't discover dust mite allergen until about 1960. And that's when they realized that people were allergic to dust mites. But, dust mites and all mites have been around for ever, basically millennia. And, I find, for example, if you take a sample from a mold colony, you always find droppings from mold-eating mites. So I might find a dozen different species of mites at home, and dust mites are really only one species out of, I think, of maybe 40,000, named species. But I'm very, very allergic to dust mites. And I always thought, to understand the enemy, I need to see them up close. So I've actually had a bunch of dust mite colonies and watched them very, very, very carefully. So they've been around forever. They've been, in people's, bedding since day one, since people, from the first time somebody made a mat out of hay or something like that. So they've been around for a long time, and it wasn't until the medical world caught up with them to say that, here they are, they're a problem.
But you actually have a dust mite circus? Is that like what you have in your somewhere in your house?
Well, I'll tell you what was so interesting to watch. I would, if the relative humidity is below 70%, the dust mites have what would you call irreversible loss of moisture. They dry up, they desiccate. So they're in equilibrium with the humidity in the space around them. So they don't drink anything. They dust mites have little salt crystals on their palps in front, and they can actually extract moisture from the air and take the moisture from the salt crystals. So when the relative humidity is below 70%, they all congregate in a space. I can't think of the word now, but in my colonies, when the relative humidity was below 70%, you could see little yellow dots on it was on a piece of paper towel. That's how we culture them on towel with fish food. And that yellow dot could be 100 mites all clustered together. So it's called a harborage site. And a lot of roaches do that. Yeah, roaches make harborage sites. So they actually drag their eggs in. It's kind of cute. They kind of go all clustered together, and then they don't dry out because they're clustered together. So they'll be in deeper portions of the mattress or the pillow or whatever, all clustered together. And then when you get into bed, the relative humidity goes up in the mattress, and then the dust mites then can do what they do. So all they do is they fornicate and defecate and masticate. So they produce all those allergens that make people so sick.
It's like
I want to clarify. Yeah, I want to clarify. You said it on record.
I had to.
Yeah, I want to clarify. People go into a room and they'll walk in the middle of the room and they pull out something like, okay, I measured the relative humidity in this room and it is 65. So this room could not have dust mites. Can you please elaborate on what does it mean to measure relative humidity, especially bedding and other stuff where it's hard to do that, but multiple samples, something to give you an indication that the relative humidity really is something that may be elevated here?
Well, the real issue with mites is that they live primarily, where we sit and spend a lot of time. So you find dust mites in chairs where people sit a lot. I know I had one guy who retired and spent 15 years working on his stamp collection, and he was sat in the same cushioned chair. And there were so many dust mites in that chair. If you snapped your fingers, the chair would come towards you without the person on it. So, it was grotesque, and he was deathly ill from that. So if you measure the relative humidity, I've done this actually. I woke Connie up with a sling psychrometer in the middle of the night. I was under the covers, with a flashlight, taking the relative humidity. It's true.
I can't even picture this. Actually, I can. That's what's scaring me.
Horrible nightmare.
And the relative,
spinning noise, the light.
Well, what a great illustration that would make in the book. I'm telling you. Yeah.
I now have a digital thermal hygrometer, so I don't disturb her. But if you measure the ambient relative humidity, under the covers, it's pretty much close to the room air. So the only place that it's really high is under your body directly where you're sweating into the mattress. So all of that mite activity is right there, or it's in the seat. But as soon as you get out of bed, they all congregate together in their little harborage sites, and they sit there waiting for you to come back. The same thing.
Boy, there's just a loaded path right there with your digital hydrometer under the covers. So we'll just move on to another topic.
Yeah, we're going to let that go. I want to remind our virtual studio audience in about a minute or two, or maybe 3. We're going to invite you to turn your cameras on. We'll still ask you to keep your microphones muted and use the reactions button down in your lower part of your window with your cursor to raise your hand. And our moderator, editor of Healthy Indoors Magazine, Susan Valenti, who's lurking in the chat right now, will acknowledge you, and I'll let you guys come in and ask questions of Jeff and Connie, or Joe and I, if you'd like to. Yeah, I have a question for you, Jeff, though. So you touched on it just briefly before you spoke of dust mites, the mold eating mites. My first experience actually knowing that they existed was back when I took my Macron class back in 2000 and got a microscope, and I was looking at mold off a basement wall, and I was like, there's these things, they're mites. What are these? And they're, it freaked me out too when I saw it moving on my tape lift, under it. And of course I cooked it, because it was an old halogen lamp on the, it's like the, how do they come into play? Are those mites problematic, the ones that are eating mold?
Absolutely. Yeah. They're nobody, to tell you the truth, nobody has even looked at this. There are only about, I think there's something like 400 acarologists in the world. It's such an arcane field. There's 40,000 identified species or something like that, but it's extremely difficult field to be in. So nobody really knows a lot about mites. There are a few people, but actually Larry Arliam was one of them. I think he's in Ohio State, and he has a paper somewhere that he says that every mite produces allergenic fecal material, and some of the mites have what they call a stylet. It's like a spider. They inject, I guess, enzyme into the spore, and they digest the stuff that's inside, and then they take the liquid out. They don't eat it. I think some of the mites actually chew up the spores and eat them. But there are a lot of other microarthropods that do that. I was in a case where a family was suing the town because of a flood that supposedly made their whole basement moldy. And Connie kept the clients busy upstairs while I was sort of looking around in the basement, and I took tape samples, and there was never been a flood at all, but there were dust mite fecal pellets where the spores were actually germinating within the fecal pellet. So they clearly have had this problem, this mite problem and mold problem for many, many years. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the leak that they had recently.
But you're saying the fecal pellets for the mites were a source for the mold. So that's almost like that paradigm with that whole rat colony where they were trying to grow the rats and feed the rats. So they there's a symbiotic relationship.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
Wow.
There's some of the mite. There's a mite that lives in seaweed that has like crevices in its outer skin that are the perfect size for the spores of a particular type of mold that grows in the seaweed. And so when the mites forage in the seaweed, they carry the spores up. Well, in fact, this is something that always mystified me. When you look in attics sometimes, and it's a moldy attic sheathing, sometimes you'll see colonies of mold kind of dragging along like a necklace or something. And that's actually mites that have gotten spores on their bodies and then deposited them. And then those colonies, those single spores develop into colonies. It was such a mystery. It almost looked like somebody had taken a pencil and outlined, a design on the wood, but that it has to be a foraging mite.
That's fascinating.
We also have mites on our body. We have mites in our eyebrows. There's a variety of other mites. We live with these constantly.
Maybe you do.
Yeah. No,
Demodex,
you
in
do
fact,
too.
I
the
know.
first time, that's Joe, the first time I heard about a Demodex mite, I pulled an eyelash out and I looked at it under the microscope, and God damn it, there was a mite there. Like crawling around. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. The very first time.
See,
And
this
I
is
find them in beds sometimes. They're very strange looking organisms.
this is the danger of having a microscope, Jeff.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, you start to do like the damnedest things in your house, and
I
here,
miss a
let
lot
let
of-
me look at that off the dog. I'll see what it is.
I miss a lot of football, I'll tell you.
No,
So-
you're not missing anything.
So let me. I'm going to ask our virtual studio audience now. Please, everybody, turn your cameras on. And do we have to, Susan? We have to give them access to do that, or can they just do it? I believe they can. Yeah, I think they all can do it right now. So guys, turn your cameras on, and yeah, there you go. Hello. Everybody start popping your cams on, and use the reactions button down on the lower right side of your screen to raise your hand to ask a question. And while we're waiting for people to jump in here, I have a question for Jeff and Connie. Who's the better writer and editor of you've been a dynamic duo here for a while?
I am.
That's an unfair question, I know.
Yeah, right. We knew the answer.
I am.
She taught English
I
for 40,
taught-
30 years.
I taught writing for 30 years, and that's really my skill. Jeff will dictate, and I'll listen to it, and then I'll form it into a paragraph, and then he reads it over. And
Yeah, when we did My House Is Killing Me, I would be, dictating, and all of a sudden you say, wait, and there'd be this silent moment, which would be like typing and rearranging everything.
I mean, I have to, I see for years now, you've been our longest running column in Healthy Indoors magazine. And one thing I have to always say is we never have to edit anything that comes from you guys. In fact, I have to go back to Connie chastising me back in 2015, or maybe it was 14, because we had some typos in the magazine. My editor was out for a bit, and I actually pushed an issue out. And she corrected. She sent me the issue with corrections on it as a PDF. And no, it was great because I was like, "Holy shit, you're right!" It's like, wow, I'm embarrassed. Like, and I had to write a apologetic letter back, going, "Oh yeah, well, I pushed it out without our editor proofing a lot of this."
Well, I did it for 30 years. It's a hard habit to break.
So I have a question we mentioned earlier, and it's a common theme that many people listening experience. There's a hyperactivity of mycotoxins. It's people are like, I got it in my blood. It's all over my house. This is killing me and my family. Can you just give us some common sense advice about mycotoxins? What they could be doing to the body and where they're found in the house or found in other conditions.
Right. Okay. Well, it's a shame I think probably if there's, a lot of air quality people, including me, we get a lot of referrals from people who are very concerned about mycotoxins because they found mycotoxins in their urine. And most, I would say, 99% of mycotoxin exposure is really from foods. And I've been researching this a little bit. Well, I've tested teas full of mold, like organic teas are very, very moldy.
Loose leaf teas.
Yeah, the loose leaf tea. But there are a lot of papers out there if anybody's interested on mycotoxins in food. So it's very, very common. And I've actually done some calculations where, I forget the exact number, but let's say there's, 4 picograms of ochratoxin A in an Aspergillus ocratius spore. If you calculate what concentration in the air you would need of spores, it gets to be into the hundreds of thousands. So they have shown that workers in silos who are dealing with moldy grain, concentrations in the millions, then they will have mycotoxin in their urine. But if you find mycotoxin in the urine of just anybody, not necessarily somebody in a damp building, that it's most likely from food. And that does not, I hate to think that, people are going to say, well, then mycotoxins aren't real. I mean,
No, they are
they're
Sure.
real. The thing is that I mean, the only way I can explain that people get so sensitive to these things is that the way, I have chemically sensitive, so the very low concentrations of things really bother me, and that there may be some biochemical mechanism through which people become hypersensitive to mycotoxins. So if they're in an environment where there are mycotoxins, they're reacting much more strongly than they would, from a sort of, strictly toxicological point of view, where you need thousands of times higher concentration.
I mean, a lot of our friends who had Lyme's disease seem much more sensitized to mold too.
So let's give some advice to those who get these calls. So, the people say, you know what, we not have it in our urine, but they also have it in their blood. That's a common response, because once they do one, they do the other. So what would you recommend to those who are doing these assessments as to, okay, so what would you do at a house? What would you be testing, or how would you confirm that the mycotoxins may or may not be in the home that are causing these reactions?
It's really not even possible. In fact, I had a paper with John Richards, I think it was, in mycopathologia, and there was a house on the Cape where this woman was deathly ill, and we found Aspergillus ocratius growing in her duct system. It was actually growing in dog food, and I sent that off to John Richards' lab, and they found the highest level of ochratoxin A than any sample they'd ever seen. It took them, they had to keep redoing the testing to dilute it. It was 1,500 parts per billion. And so we also took samples from the refrigerator, to get the house dust, the long-term collection, and they couldn't find ochratoxin in the dust. So it was very high in the actual duct work, but from the air, it didn't, you couldn't really get enough of it to see. Now, maybe if they had 10 pounds of dust, they could have extracted it, but with the amount of sample, there was no ochratoxin at all. So it's very difficult although I think there are some filters now where you can test for mycotoxins.
So Terry Sofer's got a question. Your camera's live and your mic's live, Terry. Your mic can be live.
Yes. With these mold-eating mites, that would seem to raise an interesting question about whether those mites are able to deactivate mycotoxins that they consume along with mold particles, or whether they might actually transmit mycotoxins.
I don't think that they would, activate or deactivate the mycotoxin, but I don't know if they could accumulate, that much in the fecal pellet. I mean, the fecal pellets are, there's 25 microns or so, and they're actually much bigger than the original spore, so they don't get aerosolized as readily. So you're less likely to breed, mycotoxin from a fecal pellet than you are from, individual spore.
Any of you in the audience who have any other questions, now's a great time to raise your hand. We've still got almost 20 minutes or so left on the show, and we'd love to entertain your questions. I had another question for you, for both of you, Jeff and Connie. How did you ever come up with the original title of the book, My House is Killing Me? I know in pre-show we had a little conversation about that, but certainly could be considered an inflammatory title.
Yeah. Well, we actually we came back to the office one day. This is many years ago, and there was a woman she was describing her health situation.
The message she left.
And it was a phone message, a recorded message. And at the end of the message, she said, "My house is killing me." So that was how we came up with the title. And it turns out that this house she was living in, she said, the only room that I can be in the house is the bedroom, which was an addition to the house, and every other room in the house had not registers and supplies for a heating system that had been abandoned. So they had been a hot air heating system. They switched over to hot water, but they left all the registers, supplies, and everything. They were all open, and she had a very moldy basement. So the basement air was infiltrating through all of those supplies into every room except the bedroom, where it was new, didn't have any opening to the basement.
Okay, so let's see how well the cobbler's shoes are in their own house. So I have some questions back to you guys. So What do you guys have in your home that you would recommend that others do? Like, do you have air purifiers, HEPA filtration, and do you have an air handling duct system? Do you have a HEPA vacuum? What are you guys doing to make your home healthier now that you know some of the challenges that go along with just living in a normal home with cloth material stuff?
I'm married to Connie.
No, we should start with the construction of the house, actually. We chose to live here because the builder would do, it's a new, we're the first occupants, we're the first primary owners of the house. And the builder would build it the way Jeff wanted. And the foundation is insulated on the outside, so we have no fiberglass insulation in the basement. The basement's unfinished, but it's easy to condition it. We have a heater down there. And then we have a duct system, but Jeff insisted on the highest level of filtration in the duct system that we could get. And we have a separate hot water heating system. So in the winter, we shut off the duct system so warm house air won't rise up into the ducts and fuel mold growth.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, for people out there. One of the, we have separate heating and cooling. I couldn't live with a hot air heating system because you're constantly circulating all the allergens. But if you have a separate air conditioning system in an attic and you're in a climate where, it's cold in the winter, you can actually have condensation in the air conditioning system. I've opened a couple of them up and there were puddles of water. I think I have a picture in the book, actually, of one. This guy was deathly ill, and he had asthma, and he was running humidifier in his bedroom all the time. And I disconnected one of the ducts. It was a big house, and there was a long trunk duct. It must have been about 30 feet long. And I looked down, and there was water dripping down the walls, and there was a puddle in the underneath the filter. And the duct that I disconnected was completely black. It was flexible ductwork, and all the dust was covered with mold. So if anybody has an air conditioning system that's not run during the duct system isn't being used during the winter and it's cold, they should seal all the registers and cover the filter with foil or saran wrap or something so that it's fairly airtight.
We have no wall-to-wall carpeting. We have all hard flooring.
A few rugs.
We have a HEPA vacuum. We use unfragranced cleaning and body products, and we don't burn jar candles. It's a lifestyle. The lifestyle choices, really, they can make a big difference.
But I can tell you, really, the most frustrating thing for me was that the only room in the house that really bothered me at all was my own office. And I took samples. I tried, did particle counts and all kinds of things, and never really could, it was like surrogate allergens. There'd be small particles in the air, but I have no idea what they are or why they were bothering me. And I finally got an air filter, and that helped. But what the key was, I walked by my bookshelf one day and I started coughing, and I realized I have all these old books from college, things that have been stored in my basement, and you can see it's now covered with plastic. I'm going to clean them eventually, but I couldn't do it in the winter. But behind me, you can see the polyethylene that's covering all the books, and that's made 100% improvement. And the dust on the books, it's just, there's nothing really definitive there. I believe it's from the air conditioning, because the air conditioning blows blows a certain amount of dust around, and it's impossible to avoid some sort of microbial growth in that system.
Well, especially when you're talking about books, we've had clients over the years, one in particular who I won't name because they wouldn't be happy if I did, but a federal government entity that had a very rare historic book collection in this higher up management person's office, and books that were hundreds of years old leather bound books, and this person was getting ill in the office. And that was really that was the source. It was actually this historic collection of books that was causing it. So you mentioned earlier that you don't have any fiberglass in your basement. And I think that's interesting because what you see a lot of times is fiberglass, right, gets stuffed in the rim joist, right, which is kind of like a futile effort anyway, because it certainly doesn't air seal anything. And then how about the vinyl covered fiberglass wall mat that builders like to hang 4 feet down in a basement?
Yeah, actually, there's that new system, something, I forget who makes it, that it's fiberglass with vinyl, and I've actually found mold growing in that already too. I mean, I actually wrote a paper on that. I think there was 50 samples of fiberglass from basements and crawl spaces, and actually worked with Chin Yang on that. So he did the sort of the microbial part to identify things, and more than half of the samples had severe mold growth in them.
In the dust, growing on the
in the
dust.
fiberglass, what happens is the fiberglass traps sawdust particles and pollen and all sorts of biodegradable debris. And then if the relative humidity gets high enough, the mold actually starts to grow. And I have pictures in the book of that, of actually hyphae growing around fiberglass fibers. So it's very common to find mold growth in fiberglass insulation. The industry says, no, mold can't grow on fiberglass. It's a mineral, but it's growing on the dust particles that are trapped in the fiberglass.
Yeah, can we
the
reiterate
binder
that?
too, right?
Yeah,
The
right.
binder, because it's vitreous glass. I heard that argument back in my NADCA days when we got into the battles with the insulation manufacturers about internal lining and ductwork, right? And I was doing presentations back in the early 90s on that and constantly being harassed over it because they say, oh, it's vitreous glass fibers, they don't support microbial growth. It's like, yeah, but you've got binders, you've got adhesive binders that are organic material, and you've got tons of organic debris in there.
Yeah, Chin Yang did a paper on that too. He said he did 1,200 samples of duct liner, and half of them were severely contaminated with mold growth.
So let's just go on record. I think it's a safe thing to say, wherever you could find dust, you could find mold. Is that something that could be easily stated as at some point, even in dry climates, there are moisture conditions that could be elevated enough in certain areas that wherever you find dust, you actually could find some type of mold growth potentially.
Well, it's pretty much synonymous, I guess. I mean, it's just, most of the dust in the house is skin scales. I mean, if you look at the dust on your TV screen or the top of a dresser, you take a tape sample and it's 90% skin. You maybe find some cellulose fibers and maybe a few pollen grains and spores.
Pet dander, if you have a pet.
Pet dander, yeah. So, but if you look in a closet where, at the baseboard, this is a sort of interesting thing for anybody to do. You look at the baseboard trim where the dust is collected inside a closet, and instead of being sort of homogeneous and gray, it's going to be splotchy, and often there'll be like little dark spots, and that's all bug poop. All the sort of microarthropods, the book lice, silverfish, mites. There are all of these organisms, spiders, that forage around, and then they just convert all of these simple nutrients to allergens.
Bob's got a question, but I want to clarify that every day we shed our entire body of skin cells. That's just a lot of stuff, 7 million plus an hour. So you're talking about like, oh, we have this in our homes. No, we have a lot of this in our homes.
30 grams a month. Yeah, I get mailed samples from people all the time. They're worried about the dust, something terrible in the dust. And it's always
them.
I had a sample that somebody sent from a piece of wood at the bottom of the bed, and all of the skin scales were big. It was interesting. Well, the scales were huge clumps. There'd be like 20 or 30 chunks of skin, and somebody had some kind of skin condition, and they were doing a lot of scratching. So when you scratch your skin, you get these big chunks of skin. So I said, you probably have some sort of a skin condition. In fact, one of the skin clumps was full of yeast.
Oh,
So
Jeff.
Yeast is okay. I mean, it's still a family term, right?
yeah, well,
Of course.
yeah, but it causes dandruff. You can get these skin conditions from yeast. So
Yeah, scratchy. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
creative.
This is good stuff. So we have a question from one of our audience members. Tony, do you actually want to ask it live?
So yeah, Jeff and Connie, thank you. This is great. Very good job. What do you do? Your house is new. I mean, do you open up your windows in the summertime and actually let air blow through? I mean, I know there's there's toxins outside. I understand that, but do you air it out like the old wisdom?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we, occasionally air it out, but I mean, we have the good filtration. And I think as long as you don't have any internal generation of stuff, it's not that much of a problem. I guess you know.
Excuse me, I'm gonna answer the phone.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't, we have the in the spring and in the fall, I guess we have open windows, but in the summer and in the winter, it's, pretty much shut.
Air conditioning. Yeah.
So you clearly have a passion for what you do, Jeff, and we all appreciate what you have taught us. But let's go back. What actually got you here? Like, what was the one incident that you said, you know what, I want to learn more about that? And next thing you know, you have dust colonies growing in your own house to observe their habits. So, what actually sparked you many years ago?
Well, I think we had a kid with asthma, and then we had trying to figure out, what that was doing, and then my own allergies. I mean, I had.
Well, it's kind of a dramatic story, actually. Remember when our son was in 6th grade, he had a terrible asthma attack in the middle of the night, and he was really having trouble breathing. And so the pediatrician said, take him immediately to Children's Hospital, and he was on oxygen for a week. And then a regular pediatrician wanted to put him on, a medication regimen. And Jeff said, well, let's see if there are triggers in the home that are problematic. And he did essentially an inspection, and we found a lot of issues. And then we ended up moving out of the house, actually, because they had hot air heat. And Ben got better. I mean, he did need medication, but we changed the environment, and it made a huge difference.
Yeah.
And that's what got Jeff interested in this.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest problem was the dust mites. I mean, I even in our own bed, I took samples from and sent them off for dust mite analysis, allergen, and the risk of asthma is 10 micrograms per gram of dust, 10 micrograms of, no, I'm sorry, yeah, 10. And it was 40 on our mattress. And Ben's was outrageous too. This is one of the interesting things. If you sweat a lot, he slept under quilts, and he sweat a lot, and so that increased the likelihood of having dust mites.
That's actually an interesting motivation for getting into it. So I mean, that drove you down this path, and here you are, almost 30 years later, right? Just shy of 30 years in the industry.
Yeah.
What's changed though? I mean, what have you seen? Obviously, the obvious elephant in the room is the last year in the pandemic, because that was a big, once in a century type event. But how have you seen the industry change? What stayed the same and what needs to change? And just your thoughts.
Well, I guess the shame, I guess, is the big players are. Like, for example, the air conditioning industry, they still don't want to admit that the mold's an issue, and I think they can get away with it because only about 10% of people are really allergic to mold. At most, like 15%, something like that. So and what is it? AirTray says if 80% of the people are happy with the air quality, then that means you have good air quality. So you're leaving the people who are sensitized out of the picture completely. So I don't think there's been a lot of give there at all. They don't want to admit that there's a problem. So there is, I think, more awareness about filtration in systems, I think, and COVID has certainly increased that. I mean, people are buying up air filters now for their heating equipment, so that's good.
Well, it's a separate profession. It wasn't in the beginning, I mean, IAC was not
Right.
that old an organization.
Right, yeah.
So one of the things you're able to do yourself is you actually can do your own diagnostic. You can do a sample and then actually check it. So what kind of advice can you give to others out there that aren't skilled at that and want to do a bunch of samples? And that actually adds up to a lot of money for your client. And many of them say, oh, I can't do that. I can only afford 5 samples or whatever it is. How do you find a compromise for those of us who aren't reading our own slides? What's your advice?
Learn how to read your own, learn how to read the slides. I mean,
but learn how to take the samples. I mean, people go into
yeah.
crawl spaces first, and then they go and they
that's
take
true.
a sample in
Yeah.
the living room, and they find a mold spore that was really in the crawl space that got on their clothing.
Yeah.
I think, to have a really careful regimen about how they sample and what order they sample. I think that's very important.
You can't have dirty clothing. I mean, it's amazing the problems that have been created, by people walking into a space. They came out of a crawl space or some other, remediation environment, and then they're taking samples. But I see that's a nice thing. I do all my own analysis. I don't charge people for the sample. So I take, 15, 20 samples in a typical site visit. And I guess that's a real sort of limitation for people.
But I think, and also I think it's important that they understand what kind of microfungi come from the outside, and what kind of spores can come from internal microfungal growth. So, I've seen reports where basidiospores, which come from the outside, are reported as being at worrisome levels inside a house. Well, it came from the outside through a window or an open door. So I think just have some knowledge of the science of fungal growth is very important.
That would help a lot. I mean, we actually had a call from a guy who was told to demolish his bathroom. He had an entirely tiled bathroom, floor, ceiling, walls, everything, shower, and the person took an air sample, and he had a very high concentration of basidiospores, and they told him he had to demolish his bathroom. And I looked at the report, I laughed, and I called him up. I said, if you don't have mushrooms coming out of the floor, you don't have to worry about, you don't have to demolish anything.
Right.
It's terrible.
But that's a function of, people that are out there, doing things and not qualified to make those assessments. And right, you are in that, in that small percentage of people that are consultants in the industry that do in-house work. I know John Solomon's one that comes to mind too, up in Ontario, that does in-house. And so you take more samples. I'm the same way. I'll take 100 tape lifts in a place because I can look at them under a microscope. But in absence of that, I think we have to really stress out to the practitioners, especially the new practitioners, the inexperienced ones, that these are not absolutes, right, Jeff? I mean, when we take samples, we're taking small snapshots. A tape lift is a half square inch. An air sample is a couple of cubic feet of air at a 5-minute interval. I mean, these are small little fragments that we're trying to extrapolate big information out of.
Yeah, I mean, the most important thing that I really look at is in indoor. I mean, I think you can say if you've got penicillium or aspergillus spores or, non-outdoor type cladosporium in a sample, that there's an indoor problem. And the biggest difference in that, unfortunately, only a couple of labs report on that, is if you have chains of spores. So if I see a chain of 10 penas spores in an air sample, I know that there's growth indoors, because they never occur that way outdoors. And the labs, unfortunately, they just say, well, you have 10 penas spores, and so it doesn't really mean anything. So
I also think professionals can't be dismissive. I mean, they can't they can't use a report as evidence that there's not a problem if the person's experiencing symptoms.
Absolutely, yeah. But I mean, the labs, everybody, I think for people who are taking samples, they should insist that the lab that they use tell them if there are chains of penicillium or aspergillus spores, or clusters, or the same for gladius or conidiophores, certainly. But I mean, the only thing that you see outdoors is cladosporium, big clusters of them, but they usually have cladosporium herbarium, so they're big, and that you can really distinguish them from the ones inside. And the other thing that I use looking at spores is the spores that come out of the heating and cooling system. They often have carbon particles on them, because they're impacted by soot, and they get the carbon off of the black lining material. So if the spores are dirty, you never see a dirty spore outdoors like that. I have never seen one. So
right.
Important.
So it's that time where I'm going to ask you one last question. I'm going to make those ones very difficult for you, Jeffrey. I know that you guys have this is one problem. So it's your advice that you want to give to others, but I'm going to give you the first two obvious ones. Is that listen to your clients. Most people don't do that. Use your brain in terms of taking in all this information. And what's the third thing that they're not doing? So if they are doing these things, what's the next step for them to make strong conclusions and really provide great advice for their clients?
Listen to your brain, believe your client. Use your senses. Use your eyes, use your nose, use your
Right.
tongue, you know,
That's a good one.
be
Yeah.
be a receptor, you know, be aware of the environment and really use all your senses. I think that's important.
Trust your gut.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a phenomenal information. I think anybody who's listening or will listen to this in the future will be like, wow, that was a lot to digest. And I think more people will be wanting to get your book or listen to your book and read more of your articles that you have. So there were multiple article opportunities that we found here today that we will be leaning back to you guys to help us produce and help Bob produce on the show.
Thank you for having us.
So,
You know, it's you have such a wealth of knowledge, and you know, thank you guys for for your support all these years and contributing to Healthy Indoors magazine. Your column is one of our most widely read features every month, and it's great that you can find the time out of your busy schedules to actually get us that. So let me do another plug for your book. The book again is My House is Killing Me, second edition. It's available. It can be purchased on Amazon, but it can also be through your website, correct? So that would be at May.
No, we don't sell the books.
Oh, we take that back. Okay, so the book.
Our website can link you,
Oh, okay. So, but your website is mayindoorair.com. Right?
yeah.
So that they can get to that and get some information on it. Joe, you come here on behalf of an entity too that does some interesting stuff.
Yeah, so I actually am a healthy building consultant, and you mentioned building science earlier. I think you need to be a healthy building scientist, which means you're hypersensitive to the chemicals that are in the home and the products.
An unhealthy one would be a bad building scientist.
Yeah. So, but they are out there, but they just don't claim them to be that way. So yeah, but I'm not just a healthy building scientist. I'm a good healthy building scientist. Anyway, thanks for the distraction, Bob. So, but you're also into ventilation. If you understand ventilation and the chemicals that are in your house or the allergens in your house, then you are a healthy building scientist. So, and that all comes from Hayward Score, haywardscore.com. We have a survey that you can answer probably in around 10 minutes. It advises you about conditions in your house and makes you very aware of your house. And we also believe that the occupant is the number one receptor in the house. So
Right.
you can bring whatever tools you want, but that person is so much more sensitive to any tool you can buy for even $100,000. So that's our focus, and you can find more out on our website. Thank you.
Excellent. And I'll do the shameless plug for Healthy Indoors. So we are a monthly free digital publication. Our USA edition comes out every month. March edition will be out shortly. We are also debuting in very short order, like in about a week. We'll have our first edition of our global version of the magazine, and this will be a quarterly digital publication as well. It'll be free like our monthly USA edition, but it'll be more world-centric. So the topics will be from authors around the planet. So more of a worldwide view on IAQ issues and sustainability issues. So look for that. And furthermore, we also have the Healthy Indoors Global Community, which is being betaed and being tweaked, and that'll be released at the end of the month. And that's an online portal that you in the industry will be able to become part of and actually use to network with other professionals in the country, all around the globe, share events, share content. It's really going to be a very, very exciting portal. So we're excited for that. We'll be streaming the show live there as well. Definitely more news on that coming up in the next week. Now, as Susan will remind me before she even has to put it in the chat, next week's show is also a great show. We will be taking a look back at the year of COVID. All right. So it's about a year since we launched this live weekly show based on the pandemic. And with us next week, we have Dr. David Krause, Dr. Richard Corsi, and Scott Armour, all of whom Dr. Corsi hasn't been on our show before, but the other two gentlemen have been on a lot of our episodes talking about COVID. So we're going to take a look back at the year that we've all experienced, what we've learned from it, and take a look forward. So this is a show you definitely don't want to miss next week. So definitely join us here. We'll always be back at the same bat time, same bat channel. You can now watch us live. You can be part of our studio audience like many here, or you're also able to watch the show after the fact. We put the recordings up about a day later, and there's an audio podcast associated with the show. So that's I think that's enough promo on that. Jeff and Connie, thanks so very much for being here. It's just a great time to always speak with you guys. I'll always learn and always enjoy what little time we get to share together at events.
Thank you.
Thanks,
We
Bob.
feel the same way.
And Joe, as always, it's great to have you here. And I do have to say my sarcasms, and poke in some things here and there because it's just how I roll. But Joe Medosh is no stranger to being on top of his game either. So with that, I would like to thank you all for watching the show this week. And we'll be leaving. We'll see you next Thursday here live, 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time for the Healthy Indoors live show. Until then, I'm your host, Bob Krell. Stay healthy, stay well.